our next presenter here is on making every seed count, crop management effects on canola establishment. Chris Holzapfel with Indian Head Agriculture Research Foundation will be presenting here today. How close did I come on the name? Pretty good. I was practicing this morning. So he was raised on a small mixed farm near Odessa, Saskatchewan. He has a farming background and nearly 25 years of experience with field crop research. He began as a field technician with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and continues as a research manager with IHARF, which is a nonprofit producer group who he's been with since 2005. His education includes a diploma from Olds College, a Bachelor of Science from the University of Lethbridge, a master's degree from the Department of Soil Science in the University of Manitoba, and he holds numerous numerous memberships to professional organizations. And he's also previously served as the associate editor of the Canadian Journal of Plant Science and received the Outstanding Young Agrologist Award in 2014. Please welcome Chris to the podium.
Thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be back here at the U of M. Don't get here too often, but always really enjoy this conference. And I really like Scott's talk. He gave a lot of really interesting, neat crops, lots of failures, a few successes, well, lots of successes too. And I guess I'm going to zero in on the juggernaut that is canola. So 30% of acres in Manitoba, if I remember correctly from Scott's presentation. And really, we're just going to focus on some of the basic agronomy factors, management, and as how they affect crop establishment. And of course, we have to look at yield a little bit with that. And I'll try to go pretty quickly here. I know that everybody's going to be getting hungry, and we've got a jam-packed session this afternoon to get through as well. So I don't think we really need any convincing that canola seed is an important input and one that we need to make the most of. The cost is substantial. Like many inputs, it's gone up quite substantially over the past few years. This is some data from Alberta that I think showed that it's increased by 16 or 17% just over the last 4 years. And really that makes it the second biggest expense in growing canola. Number one, of course, by a fairly large margin is nitrogen fertilizer. That's 28%. But behind that, we've got seed, which makes up about 19% of the total cost. Usually $700 to $800 a bag, which will seed anywhere from maybe 10 to 12 acres of canola. So that's kind of what we're looking at for cost. Some of the things that we're going to run through today, I guess, is seeding date. Of course, that's going to be important and something that everyone has to consider. Always lots of questions. Row spacing, well, I got a few slides on that we'll slide through, and I guess how that might affect your seeding rates and if there's any implications for side-banded fertilizer rates, nitrogen in particular. Phosphorus management, so placement, different forms, and their suitability for seed row placement. A wee little bit on preceding fall rye cover crops, and then I guess some seeding technology. We've got some where we looked at different metering technologies, and then I'm stealing some data from Alberta where they tested some different implements. Very little bit on seed size, and then we'll finish up with just some critical plant populations and options for reseeding when those plant populations aren't where they need to be. So seeding dates, first and foremost, and I guess this is kind of always a fairly it's not complex, but it can be a little bit of a difficult one to zero in on. I think when it comes to yield potential and really giving that crop the best opportunity to finish strong, early seeding is desirable, but that does come with, and I guess part of that is you can take advantage of that early season moisture. Importantly, we can get that crop flowering maybe before some of the real heat and drier periods later in July. And then, of course, be less susceptible to an early fall frost, which sometimes does happen. And if that crop's not far along, you've got some big yield and quality problems. But from an establishment perspective, it can be a bit of a challenge. That early seeded canola is going to take longer to emerge. We often get frost events late in May, and you can be susceptible to that depending where your crop is at. And flea beetles, of course, is a big one. If you can't outgrow those flea beetles, then you've got some challenges that need to be managed there. So I'm just going to present a little bit of data actually from Indian Head and Swift Current that was part of a soybean trial looking at soybean adaptation in Saskatchewan. But canola was one of our check crops, I guess. So I kind of just zeroed in on some of that data to have a look at the limited amount of data I do have looking at seeding data effects on canola. So I had mentioned that early seeded canola takes longer to emerge. And this is just, I guess, some data that I wanted to show that. And And first, I'll just, I guess, throw out a caveat that we often didn't get these crops seeded as early as we would have liked to. We were shooting for very early in May for that early date, but we couldn't usually get our soybean seed early enough to achieve that. So sometimes it fell a little bit later. And I've highlighted a few dates there that range from May 6th to May 12th. And we do see, quite a pronounced just extension in the amount of time that it takes to get that crop out of the ground. While that's happening, our seed treatment's wearing off. It's just maybe reducing some vigor. So it is, I guess, just making that a little bit more important to manage that crop early in the season if we seed late. When we averaged across the 8 growing seasons there, it took us 16 days to get out of the ground with the what I'll call early seeding. Not always that early, but as early as we could get it. 10 or 12 days with our kind of mid to later in June seeding dates, and 10 days for later May to beginning of June dates. So definitely some advantages to holding off a little bit. Spring plant density, things were kind of a little bit more all over the map at this point. We certainly do see a trend in many cases where we're getting a fewer plants with that early seeding date. That could be attributed maybe to flea beetle feeding, some frost events that aren't wiping out the crop but are picking off a few plants. And I guess the other thing I'll throw in here is we would often manage insects. So if we had flea beetle problems, we'd come in there and spray them. So that might have taken away some of the effects that we saw. But on average, we are getting quite a bit higher seedling mortality with that early May seeding date than some of the later ones. Yield is a little bit of a different picture though. So, when it comes to yield, what we really see the downside is with that late seeding. Early seeding, we can typically, still do pretty good. We just need to be prepared to get out there and manage it and make the best of those plants. Maybe make sure our seeding rates are adequate to buffer against some losses. Be prepared to spray, use the best seed treatments. Mid-May seeding is always pretty good, and that's usually kind of what I target on our own farm. We'll get the cool season pulses like peas and lentils in the ground, get our cereals in the ground. Often flax ahead of canola, but then I'm getting right into that canola, and you really don't want to be pushing canola seeding back into June if you can avoid it. So there's kind of a bit of a narrow window. I'll prioritize some other crops ahead of that canola, but you don't want to let it to get too late, or you can almost guarantee yourself some yield penalties. So I think it's a bit of a balance act and just kind of managing the logistics of your farm and trying to prioritize crops. But the early seeding is generally advantageous, but we just can't let it, we just need to be prepared to manage that. Row spacing, I don't really want to spend a lot of time on, but actually we have done quite a bit of work on this and did a fairly deep dive. It's all Indian head. We've got quite a specialized drill to do some of this work where we can go from 10 to 16-inch spacing, and then we actually brought that all the way up to 24-inch just by pulling some openers up out of the ground. And we looked at, different combinations of 10, 12, 14, 16, and 24-inch row spacing in combination with different seeding rates, with different rates of sideband and nitrogen, and also some with and without in-crop herbicides. Collected lots of data. I'm just really going to zero in on some of the establishment plant populations and focus more on the seeding rates and a little bit in the nitrogen fertilizer. So these are just our overall effects of row spacing on emergence, and the response did differ by year, but really just in the magnitude of decline that we saw. It was pretty consistent that as we increased row spacing, with just a fairly typical seeding rate, normal rate of sideband and nitrogen, those plant populations are coming down. And really we can just attribute that mostly to crowding of the seed, more competition between seedlings to establish. And then also, as you'll see in a couple slides down from now, maybe a little bit more toxicity potentially from that side-banded end. As we do increase row spacing, we're side-banding that nitrogen. It's getting more and more concentrated, and in theory should be a safe distance from the seed, but depending on conditions, could still have a little bit of a negative impact. This here is actually our row spacing by nitrogen effects on emergence. And interestingly enough, we are with all row spacings, we do see as we increase that row spacing, increase that N rate, a little bit of a decline in plant populations. This was a wet period. We've got clay soil. So sometimes I didn't always get the separation that I wanted just due to, kind of tough seeding conditions. But where it's really an issue is that bottom line there is our 24-inch row spacing. And we can see that things are dropping quite pronounced, which is telling me that, that those high rates of nitrogen combined with that really wide row spacing are problematic. When it came to seeding rate, I already showed you that we are increasing mortality with increasing seeding rate, But the only one that really stands out is when we kind of really get into some pretty extreme row spacing of 24 inches. And at that point, I guess, it doesn't matter how many seeds we're throwing into the ground. We can only get so many plants established, and you see some diminishing returns going from especially 90 seeds to 120 seeds per meter squared. So certainly at that kind of row spacing, there's no point in trying to get too aggressive with your seeding rates because you're just only going to get so many plants established. It would have been nicer to go to a narrow spacing, Tammy, but 10 inches is all we could do with this drill here, and 10 to 12 is pretty typical for where I am in Saskatchewan here. We are all no-till, and that's just kind of what we do. This is just some quick yield effects here. I don't want to spend much time on it, but just wanted to show you that canola is generally quite well adapted to wider row spacing. We've got several years there where there's no impact at all. We do see some kind of funny bumps at that 24-inch spacing. I don't really buy that. I think that might be maybe some edge effects, or just even this is before some of the real good pod shatter resistance, maybe fewer harvest losses. So a couple years where actually we see a little bit of a downside maybe to the increasing row spacing, and then a couple years where it's basically flat, right, from 10-inch up to 24-inch. So as far as the crops we grow go, canola is well adapted to row spacing, but there's some advantages to keeping it, on the narrower side of things. Phosphorus fertilizer, got to spend some time on this and any talk, I guess, about canola establishment, because it's certainly an issue. And I've got a couple studies that I'm going to draw from. First was one that we did back 2016 to 2018. It was actually my colleagues up at Nelford led the project. But we just simply looked at sideband versus seed row placement for a range of rates, got pretty aggressive in our phosphorus rates. And then as a kind of an added layer with we also threw in some ammonium sulfate into that monoammonium phosphate blend. Not something you need to do, but something that people sometimes do for logistic reasons. But something that we just kind of really wanted to push it. And I guess our results varied depending on the location. So first I'm going to show you Scott, and that solid bar there is our sideband placement. And you can see we went right up to 71 pounds per acre, actual P2O5, about 150 pounds product. No impact on establishment whatsoever. It was perfectly safe. You could put down as much phosphorus as you want to, as long as we were getting that separation from the seed row. At this soil here, it's a lower pH soil, fairly coarse texture. As soon as we started putting any phosphorus in the seed row, we start to see those plant populations drop off. Not catastrophically, but even at 18 pounds an acre, we're seeing them start to come down. Throw that ammonium sulfate into the mix, and immediately we had plant populations declining, and it just really, I think, aggravates the situation a little bit worse. Indian head, that's an average of 3 years, by the way. Indian head, similar results, but not quite the same. So I guess first off, our overall plant populations were higher right to begin with. At that 18 pounds per acre rate, it didn't matter, what our placement was. It was all safe, even with that ammonium sulfate thrown into the mix. We're a higher organic matter site, finer textured soil, general moisture. So that's important to consider. It is a safer environment for in-furrow placement. But then as we started, getting up to that 36 pounds and beyond, certainly the numbers were dropping off. And we do see that with that ammonium sulfate in the mix, it's just a little bit worse. So something that if you don't have to do, I wouldn't do. When it came to yields, first, this is Scott. I will say for Indian Head and Melfort, it didn't matter how we placed that phosphorus. Our yield responses were the same for sideband, seed row, and seed row plus that ammonium sulfate. We lost a few plants, but they never fell to the point where it was really going to impact yield. It's not what we want, but it wasn't a big deal. And our yield responses were the same for all three placement methods. So that tells me two things. I guess number one, sidebanding is a good option. And number two, we can get away with a little bit more when it comes to in-furrow placement just in that environment. Here at Scott, it was a different story though, and I always get better phosphorus results at Scott. So 18 pounds an acre, we were losing a few plants if you recall, but it wasn't enough to be a big problem. Our yield responses were basically the same regardless of our placement. Very responsive site, by the way. When we bumped that up to 36 pounds, seed place and sideband were pretty similar. We're starting to see some trends. Throw that ammonium sulfate into the mix though, and we do see yields start to drop off now because we're just losing too many plants. 53 pounds an acre, a lot more separation. We're actually losing yield when we've got the ammonium sulfate in there. And at 71 pounds per acre, you see a heck of a response with side-banded phosphorus, but that loss in plants has completely negated any yield benefit or any fertility benefit when we were placing that in furrow. So side banding definitely the better option for an environment like that, especially at those higher rates. This next study here looked more at phosphorus forms, all with a focus on seed placement, but we just wanted to look at how some of the different forms that are available in Western Canada might affect that establishment when placed in the seed row. A lot of phosphorus is placed in the seed row. For some, if you're mid-row banding, it's kind of just the best option out there. And there are a lot of people, I think, who just believe it is the preferred option, the better option, so really choose to do so. So we kind of wanted to say, okay, if you are seed placing at a range of rates, what are some of the forms? Pretty big data set. I forget what it all added up to. I think I'm up to about 14 site years for this one, all across the province of Saskatchewan. So, our extreme cases would be Swift Current in the southwest part of the province, up into Melfort, Indian Head, Yorkton. So, lots of representation in the black soil zone as well. 4 forms by 3 rates, plus we had a zero P control that wasn't in the statistical analysis, but was important. Our forms were monoammonium phosphate, so the kind of the most common, just the good old 1152, cheapest, most common form available. MES 15 we had in the mix, also a pretty big market share of that product. A lot of people like it for different reasons. Crystal green or struvite, certainly less common, but it's gotten a fair bit of attention over the last several years. Known to be a good option for seed row placement, and depending on where that pea is coming from, kind of a neat environmental solution as well. But it really depends where they're getting the pea from, whether that applies. And then we did a 50-50 blend of by volume or by mass of products, of MAP and that crystal green. And that works out to 65% of your actual P2O5 coming from the MAP, 35% coming from the struvite, which is pretty close to the industry recommendations, which I think they say 75-25. So we're maybe a little bit heavy on the struvite, but basically in line with how Taurus Ag would be recommending to use this product. Our rates were 22 pounds an acre, so should be safe across a wide range of environments. 40 pounds an acre, starting to push it. 58 pounds an acre, which we hoped would maybe start getting pretty risky regardless of environment. And all of the phosphorus, again, was seed placed. Any urea, ammonium sulfate, any other stuff that we had to throw into the mix was all side banded for these trials. This is a busy slide, but I guess really what I wanted to show is that our responses really did differ by environment. We need to bear this in mind. So Indian Head and Melfort are the 2 at the top there, and those were 2 where we kind of got away with murder at these sites, really just with the finer textured soil, higher organic matter. We really didn't have any impacts of form or placement over the periods that we did this work in those environments. Once we got into our coarser textured soils, drier environments, we certainly started to have some more effects. Many case form was affected, some rate was affected, or caused an effect, sorry. But importantly, we usually did have interactions there at those responsive sites, which told us that the effect of phosphorus rate, for example, varied depending on what form of fertilizer we were using. This is just a look at establishment at those responsive sites. And those blue and green bars, the green bars is our pure struvite, pure crystal green. We can see that almost always stands out as being quite safe. Those blue bars is that blend. So usually see a few more plants dropping off, but still pretty good. The MAP and S15, when we were going to get damage, those two were going to cause it. This is just to kind of zone in on one location, Scott. I showed you some data there earlier, which is quite a responsive site, but just kind of shows that separation. So those green triangles, maybe a little bit hard to see. That's our pure struvite. No effect whatsoever, even at that site. We could apply as much as we wanted in the seed row and get away with it. More of a decline with that blend, but it kind of intermediate, and then the MAP and struvite, of course, things were much worse. This is Yorkton, so a more forgiving environment, but a very dry year. And at this location, only the S15 was actually significant, but we saw similar trends with MAP, and then the struvite and the struvite blend were both pretty safe, with maybe the exception of that blend at that highest rate. We started to knock off some plants, but didn't really show up in the stats. This is just our 14 site average of those canola establishment numbers there. So really it's just kind of showing what I've already showed you, where that struvite is very safe, our blend a little bit more intermediate, but still quite safe. Then comes MAP, and the S15 usually a little bit hotter than the MAP actually. And bear in mind with that MAP, we're not adding ammonium sulfate to balance all of the nutrients. It's just MAP. That sulfur is going into the sideband, and that's why we see that difference there. Just our 14 site average really mimics kind of what we've seen at Scott, just not quite as extreme. When it came to yield, things did vary by site, and in most cases, actually all forms were pretty good when we were getting the phosphorus responses. When we averaged out overall, though, we actually see that the pure struvite wasn't quite as effective, and I think that's maybe just a testament to that crop not being very soluble, and in a low P soil, maybe not quite as available early on in the season, which is why I think really you look at the blend with that product. It's also very expensive. Higher P soils really didn't matter what form that we used, but on average, we didn't get quite the yield responses there. I know I'm not going to spend much time on this fall rye cover crop effects. My real interest in this was how that cover crop might affect our response to nitrogen. But I often get asked, even of people who are wanting to terminate a rye crop, can they come in and plant canola to that crop? What's the impact going to be? So I thought maybe it's relevant to just show at least one slide here. And for the most part, we didn't have much impact at all of that cover crop on a canola establishment. In 2021 was kind of a weird year. When we did our final stubble counts after the combine went through, we saw a little bit of a decline, but it was nothing to be worried about. And that was a weird year where it was extremely dry in the fall and the early spring. That cover crop really didn't establish. Actually, a lot of the plants only came up after the canola was seeded when we finally got some rain. And it might have just been some allelopathic effects there as that rye was emerging kind of at the same time as the canola, or maybe after I applied the in-crop herbicide and killed that rye, maybe took out a few plants, but nothing to worry about. 2022, we actually had really nice establishment of the fall rye cover crop, good ground cover there, sprayed it, seeded the next day, and no impacts whatsoever on canola. So, I don't think it's anything to be worried about. We'll move on to some seeding technologies here, and I should be able to move fairly quickly through these, but the first trial I want to show you really just looks at some different rollers, and this is when Seedmaster first came out with that Ultra Pro roller. We wanted to look at the ability to meter low rates of canola seed and how that might, if one roller can maybe do a better job of distributing them uniformly than the other. Few locations, we had the two roller types. So either that Seedmaster Ultra Pro canola roller versus just a normal fine fluted Valmar roller. Seeding rates ranging from 10 all the way up to 320 viable seeds per meter squared. And I'm just going to show you some data on establishment and distribution of seedlings. And in essence, we didn't see any benefit to both rollers did a pretty good job, is what it kind of came down to. And I suspect that some of the issues that we see on commercial drills isn't so much related to our metering at the roller level as it is to, maybe distribution at some of our secondary distribution towers, physical damage to the seed, some other factors that we just weren't able to measure in our small plot drills. This isn't our work, but it is new and somewhere fairly new, I guess, and I think relevant, but it's from Farming Smarter out in Alberta. And they just looked at actually different drill types, and seeding rates for canola across a couple different environments in Alberta, one of those being irrigated. Their drills were just a normal air drill, custom-made kind of plot drill, 12-inch spacing. They had a monosim planter, also on 12-inch spacing. And then I think the same planter were able to move that row spacing out to 20-inch spacing. All drills had sideband nitrogen placement, so it was really just kind of the placement of the seed and the metering that varied there. And this is a little busy, but kind of shows that when it came to establishment, similar to what I showed you before, that wide row was kind of always the loser. We're knocking off more plants there, especially at the high seeding rates, not so much at the lower seeding rates. Kind of back and forth when it came to air drill and the planter. The planter generally did have the edge over the air drill. These are just our average numbers, so across all seeding rates. And when they looked at this, basically the narrow row planter was advantageous over the air drill 25% of the time, 75% of the time. The two perform statistically similar. The narrow row versus wide row, the narrow row beat that wide row 25% of the time, 75% of the time. There was no difference there either, at least not statistically. There were certainly some trends. When it came to yield, the wide row was kind of the clear loser, I guess, of the bunch. That one didn't generally perform as well. Not every year, but the 20-inch spacing just did come with some disadvantages. Between the narrow row air drill and the planter, the planter did have a slight edge, but it often went both ways. And for 5 out of 12 sites, there was no difference at all. So I would say there could be an advantage to the planter as long as you can handle the residues that you need to handle. You know, you've got what you need when it comes to fertilizer metering and placement, but not to the extent where I'd probably go out and buy new equipment to do so. If you already have one, I think it can be a good implement to seed your canola. Little bit on seed size. You know, I think this one here, there's really not a lot to talk about, and I don't like to weigh too heavily on it, but basically we just wanted to look at how seed size might affect the establishment here. And so we had 2 hybrids, 2 seed size, large versus smaller within the lots, separate lots of seed, which I have a little bit of problem with. And really all that kind of showed was, I just have this one slide that showed some pretty strong trends for higher mortality with the narrow seeds, but you know, not always statistically significant and nothing that I would be concerned about. You know, I think there's pretty good standards of hybrid canola seed when it comes to vigor and viability. Last study here, I do have a few slides, but I'm going to try to burn through them quickly to get us into lunch. But this was some older work, but still very relevant to the project. And so it's looking at canola response to low plant populations and our options for reseeding. So first objective, basically, what is that critical threshold of plant populations that we need to see with canola to achieve 180, 90% yield potential? You know, how does that affect yield, maturity, quality, all that? To establish the minimum plant densities where we might recommend reseeding. And then if we are going to reseed, what are the best options to do so? Lots of locations over a 3-year period. We had 2 studies. One was our plant population study and one looked at our reseeding options. I should spend a little bit of time on these reseeding options. So with early May, we either had our good stand or our poor stand. Our poor stand, we just seeded 20 seeds per square meter to kind of simulate a crop failure. When it came to reseeding, we either came in early June or mid-June and reseeded to our same medium maturing hybrid that we used in early May, a short season hybrid, or Polish canola, which is very short season but has some disadvantages. Minimum plant populations, we found that actually 28 plants per square meter could get us 100% of the yield. 18, 90% of the yield, 12 plants got us 80% of the yield. Those are actually fairly conservative numbers. You know, we had some cases where it was a lot smaller, and the most we ever needed was 30 plants per square meter to achieve top yield. Came with some challenges. This is our maturity. You can see those low plant populations are you know, certainly causing some problems there. It also showed up a little bit in green seed. When it came to reseeding options, this was a little bit of a tough deal. You know, as long as we could get in there in early June, we were best off to stick with that high yielding hybrid. Did quite well with our short season hybrid. Polish never really worked, and reseeding in June 15th was really never desirable. We were always losing some yield or substantial yield, and even at that late date, you still didn't want to get into the Polish. Big issues with green seed with that late seeding as well. So that's something to be aware of. Some of that might have been our own harvest management. And when it came to profits, basically we've got some numbers here with and without some insurance benefits. And without the insurance benefits, reseeding was rarely actually made sense economically once you factored in the cost of that operation. With the reseeding benefit, our best option was either of the hybrids. In early June, mid-June reseeding, we're always losing money. With that, I'm kind of done with the slides, and I guess should I just run through these or should we shut her down?
Well, I think we're right on time here for lunch here. But maybe we'll take one question from the audience here real quick, if there's something from the audience. And in the meantime, I'm just gonna, let's thank Chris here for his presentation here today.
I appreciate that was very quick. This is my contact info, and really with the recaps, just kind of recapped what I had gone through there. So,
yep.
So hopefully everyone was able to catch that.
Yeah.